Money has never been just coins and bills, but stories hidden in pages few have read. Humanity has always written two histories, the official one, recorded in documents and monuments, and the invisible one, kept in hidden records. There, in those books not intended for the people, wars were decided, fortunes were preserved, and the destinies of entire kingdoms were determined. The metaphor of the hidden ledger is also a metaphor for life. What is revealed and what is hidden. A balance that no one sees, but that defines everything that happens on the surface. This audiobook doesn't open the official pages of history, but rather those that have been left in the shadows. Those pages where temples weren't just places of prayer, but banks, where sacred promises became calculations of power. An invisible book, one that no one teaches in schools, but that has been with the world since we learned to count. The listener who enters here will not be a mere spectator, but a witness to the untold. And a silent accomplice to the truth that beats between light and shadow. The earliest numbers were offerings recorded on clay tablets, not simple grain accounts. They were invisible pacts between humans and gods, records that sustained faith and economics at the same time. When the priest wrote a number in a temple, he did so not only as a witness to a tribute, but as a guardian of a power greater than the king. Accounting was born within sacred walls, but it soon became a language of domain. What wasn't counted in the plaza was hidden in those secret accounts, and it was there that the wealth of an empire was defined. The people saw only the offerings, the golden statues, the marching armies. They never saw the numbers that decided whether there would be bread on the table or spears on the battlefield. In every era, visible history was only the shadow of a hidden accounting. The hidden book was always there, silently writing itself. And now, slowly, we open it. No one said it out loud, but every war was first a balance sheet. Temples lent money to the king. Kings mortgaged the future of their people, and people gave their sweat to pay debts they knew nothing about. The peasant believed he was fighting for the glory of his nation, unaware that he was fighting to make the numbers on a hidden scroll add up. Wars never began in the fields, but in books. Numbers were the first soldiers, accounts the first generals, interests the first enemies. The common man died without knowing he had been counted in a column of losses. The winner celebrated, unaware that he was just another number on a lender's balance sheet. Thus, the history of blood has always been written in invisible ink. The hidden book had no heroes or villains, just numbers. And those numbers decided life and death. Time passed, empires fell, and the numbers remained. What seemed eternal in marble collapsed, but the beads remained in neat columns. Egypt's gold traveled to Rome, Rome's gold to Byzantium, Byzantium's gold to Venice, and there was always someone keeping track. It didn't matter if cities burned or kings died. The hidden books survived because they did not belong to a time, but to an eternal logic. Invisible accounting was like an underground river that never stopped running. Above, thrones were changing. Below, the secret flow continued. And although people lived on the surface of events, the real power remained in the hands of those who knew how to add and subtract in the shadows. That power was never democratic. That power was always silent. The listener who enters here does not hear a common story, but the revelation of a hidden mechanism. A cog that, though invisible, moves the world's destiny. This audiobook won't ask you to believe in conspiracies, but rather to observe what has always been right in front of your eyes. that every coin in your pocket is the shadow of a decision someone made in secret. That every tax, every bill, every debt corresponds to numbers you've never seen in your life. That the news you read only tells one half of the story, while the other half is written in fact sheets that never make it to the newspapers. You are a witness to that duality, and this story only opens a window. The rest of the story, you'll know when you close your eyes and remember there were always two books. Uno visible, and another hidden one. Chapter 1. Temples as Banks. The history of accounting was born not in markets nor in the palaces of kings, but in temples. Mesopotamia was the setting where calculation became sacred, where every grain of barley and every goat offered to the god was recorded as an act of faith. The first clay tablets were not simple tools. They were written pacts between humans and divine. The priests, guardians of the secrets, added and subtracted not only material goods, but also spiritual promises. A recorded sacrifice wasn't just a gift, it was a guarantee that the deity recognized the debt and granted protection. The temple thus became a primitive bank, a place where offerings were deposits and prayers, interest. People came to leave their grain, their oil, their livestock, not only as tribute, but as an investment in their future. And the gods, through their scribes, administered this invisible capital that sustained the life of the entire city. The hidden book was already open, its pages made of wet clay. But the power they held was stronger than any stone. In Egypt, the logic was even more striking. The pharaoh ruled not only through his army or his lineage, but because he controlled writing and records. Each temple was an administrative center where meticulous scribes recorded the arrival of wheat, the counting of livestock, and the collection of taxes. The papyri became mirrors of power, where each number was an affirmation of cosmic order. The god received offerings, the pharaoh redistributed them, and the people obeyed because they believed everything was in balance. But behind the faith was a system of accounting that guaranteed the wealth of some and the submission of others. Temples were banks, granaries, archives, and fortresses. Not only were visible treasures kept there, but also the invisible numbers that ordered the world. Whoever controlled those records held the true power, even if the people believed it belonged to the gods. The clay tablets were small, but they contained entire universes of meaning. A simple wedge-shaped symbol could represent 10 sheep, or a man's commitment to his temple. Each mark was a bridge between material reality and the spiritual order. The scribe, sitting in the shadows, was more powerful than the armed soldier, because the legitimacy of the exchange rested in his hands. If an offering was not recorded, it was as if it had never existed. And if a single grain of wheat was miscounted, it could trigger a debt that would change the life of an entire family. The baked clay, fragile to the touch, was nevertheless the cornerstone of trust. What people didn't know was that these accounts could also be manipulated. The invisible lent itself to both faith and deception. And so the first shadow of accounting was born. More than the voice of the gods was preserved in the silence of the temples. The wealth of the people was accumulated, centralized in the hands of a few. The temple was the city's vault, and its majestic columns concealed vaults filled with grain and metals. The people saw it as a place of protection, but in reality it was a cog in the wheel of economic power. There, it was decided which village would receive aid in times of drought, and which would be abandoned to its fate. It was there that it was decided which peasant would rise and which would fall into perpetual debt. The temple was not just a place of worship, it was the financial heart of civilization. Spirituality and economics were intertwined in the same language, that of numbers. A language only a few could read, and everyone, without knowing it, obeyed. Priests were seen as guardians of divine order, but in reality they were also the first bankers. His word decided whether an offering was recorded as a settled debt or an unfulfilled promise. The people's faith in the gods translated into trust in the scribes, in their calculations, in their accounts. There was no separation between the spiritual and the economic. Giving to the temple ensured eternal life and also the future harvest. Error, or manipulation, was not perceived as mere human failings, but as divine design. Thus, the power of numbers was cloaked in mysticism, shielding it from any questioning. The peasant delivering his grain couldn't argue with the figure because arguing with it was like arguing with the gods. In this way, the temple consolidated an invisible power, a power that rested on the monopoly of writing. Accounting was a sacred secret, and whoever mastered it ruled the city. That was the true miracle of the temples. The system grew over time, becoming a sophisticated network of loans and credit. The offerings were not just gifts, but deposits used to finance works and support armies. The temple lent to merchants, charged interest, and accumulated wealth beyond the people's imagination. In the shadow of the columns, accounts were silently settled, deciding the prosperity of some and the ruin of others. The scribes were the architects of an invisible order, designing balances that moved caravans and fleets. The temple was the granary, but also the bank. It was the archive, but also the silent judge of economic destiny. Nothing happened without going through their accounts. A system that seemed natural, but was actually the result of absolute control of information. Thus, the people worked, prayed, and obeyed, unaware that their lives were written in a book they could not read. That was the true power of the occult. The tablets and papyri recorded not only the present, but also the memories of generations. A debt record could outlast an entire lineage, binding children and grandchildren to a promise they never signed. Temples were guardians of time, writing in clay what no man could forget or erase. Baked clay became the invisible prison of the people. A tablet could condemn or liberate, grant wealth or ensure misery. It was absolute power, sustained not by the sword, but by calculation. Armies protected borders, but numbers ensured perpetual obedience. The true throne was at the scribe's table, not the pharaoh's. The pharaoh might die, but the account survived, and on her rested the weight of the world. The people believed they served the gods, but they served the accounts. Each offering given was transformed into a number, and each number into a decision that no one could explain. The peasant didn't know that his grain would become wages for soldiers, trade caravans, or palaces covered in gold. Money didn't exist yet as we know it, but the concept of blind trust in a system that couldn't be seen already existed. That was the origin of the hidden book, the first hidden ledger that moved ancient civilizations. A book that wasn't written for the people, but for a select few who knew how to interpret its symbols. And those few held the future of everyone in their hands. Divinity was the excuse, but control of numbers was the reality. The temple was a bank disguised as an altar, and the people, unknowingly, were his captive clients. The temple walls were adorned with gods, but inside, numbers were the true oracles. Each number predicted famine or abundance, victory or defeat, rise or fall. The scribe, with his stylus or quill, was the medium who translated the invisible voice of the Chapter 2. Kings, Taxes, and Invisible Treasures. Kings never ruled with swords or armies alone. They ruled with hidden numbers, with parallel records that few knew about. Official accounting showed abundance, order, and justice. Secret accounting records, hidden in chests and tablets, revealed unpayable debts, excessive taxes, and hidden loot. Every empire had two faces: the public one, bright as a military parade, and the private one, dark as a closed vault. The royal advisors knew that what was written in the records could be as powerful as the sharpest sword. A secretly added tax could ruin entire villages without anyone raising a voice. Undeclared war booty could sustain years of imperial campaigns without the public knowing. Accounting became the true art of governing. And the invisible was always more decisive than the obvious. Rome perfected this practice to the extreme. The Senate knew part of the accounts, but the emperors kept others under lock and key. Official taxes were presented as necessary for the common good. The extra tributes, which no one publicly acknowledged, filled private coffers and financed imperial luxuries. In triumphal parades, people saw gold, statues, and slaves captured in distant wars. But behind the spectacle were secret calculations, hidden lists of loot and stolen treasure. The emperors knew that the people needed the theater of wealth, not the truth of balance sheets. Rome didn't fall just because of invasions. It also fell because its invisible accounts devoured trust. The gold that sustained the empire wasn't always where it should be, and corruption ended up being more lethal than any enemy. Byzantium inherited from Rome not only its laws, but also its accounting secrets. The Eastern Empire perfected the art of hiding taxes under religious symbols. Offerings to saints and donations to churches were, in reality, tributes in disguise. Byzantine emperors used monasteries as safes and bishops as accountants. The people believed they were giving to heaven, but in reality, they were feeding the empire. Each coin handed over became part of a hidden system that sustained the army and the court. Byzantium endured for centuries because it knew how to hide its financial weaknesses behind the veil of faith. But every accumulated secret was also a burden on imperial legitimacy. Parallel accounting supported the throne, but it did so silently and in the shadows. And in the end, that silence was broken too. Imperial China offered another scenario for accounting secrecy. The emperors introduced a rigid, detailed, and seemingly transparent tax system. But in the basements of bureaucracy, invisible records flourished. Local officials inflated figures, hid revenues, and diverted taxes into their own pockets. Emperors received fabricated reports, and peasants paid the price for the abuses. The dynasty's splendor shone on the great walls and palaces, but poverty reigned in the villages. Secret accounting fueled private fortunes, minor dynasties, and powerful clans. China survived thanks to its vastness, but corruption slowly eroded its structure. The invisible records were the true force that drove the empire, a force as powerful as it is dangerous. In many empires, war spoils were the greatest source of wealth. But rarely was everything caught declared. The generals hid some of the gold, some of the jewels, and some of the slaves. An official convoy returned to the palace, and a secret convoy detoured to private fortresses. Thus were born the first hidden fortunes, accumulated in the shadows of war. The violence didn't end on the battlefield. It continued in the management of the spoils. Invisible treasures became political weapons. a general could blackmail the emperor by revealing what he knew about the hidden chests. The sword and accounting were inseparable allies. Both decided who ruled and who fell into disgrace. Hidden taxes were another tool of power. They didn't appear in official records, but the peasants felt them firsthand. A tribute in kind, a donation for the king, an extraordinary contribution to defense. All disguised as civic duty, all without visible record. In Rome, the people paid for roads and aqueducts with their labor, without it being considered a tax. In Byzantium, tribute disguised as alms swelled the emperor's coffers. In China, farmers would hand over more grain than expected, under threat from officials. The numbers left in the files were always lower than what was actually charged. Accounting was a mask, and behind it lurked the true cost of the empire. A price always paid by the weakest. The economic power of kings was not measured solely in visible treasures. It was measured by the ability to hide them. A buried chest, a sealed room, a ledger written in incomprehensible ciphers. This ensured that neither enemies nor the people themselves would know the true extent of the wealth. The king could present himself as moderate, even austere, while secretly accumulating mountains of gold. And that hidden wealth was their true insurance against rebellion, invasion, or betrayal. The invisible treasures weren't just metals, they were networks of power that spanned generations. A hidden fortune could sustain a dynasty centuries after its origin. Time erased the names, but not the interest those treasures generated. The shadow was more lasting than the light. The palace accountants were enigmatic figures. They knew what no one should know. They kept secret records, handled figures that could change history. Many lived among privileges, but also among fears, because their silence was worth more than gold. A mistake in the secret accounting could mean execution. A well-kept secret could mean eternal wealth for her family. They were shadows behind the throne, invisible to the people, but indispensable to the kings. Without them, empires could not maintain their facade of stability. Invisible accounting was as vital as the military. Both held the throne with iron and numbers. The contrast between the official and the hidden was a constant play. The people saw organized tributes, clear accounts, apparent order. Behind the walls, kings and their advisors wove another narrative. Every economic decision had two versions, one that was shown and one that was hidden. The theater was necessary because the truth would have sparked rebellions. If the peasants had seen the real figures, they would have known that their sweat fueled impossible luxuries. Accounting silence has always been a weapon of control. A lie disguised as management. An apparent order sustained by an invisible chaos. The empire was only as strong as its darkest secret. And so, over the centuries, empires rose and fell with their hidden accounts. What wasn't written down weighed more than what was recorded. In Chapter 3: Double Entry, Double Truth. In the damp streets of Venice and the palaces of Florence, a new language was born. A language made of columns, sums, and balances, as powerful as any army. Renaissance Italian bankers invented double-entry bookkeeping, a method that reflected the complexity of an expanding world where trade connected seas and continents. For every credit there must be a debit, for every gain, an equivalent loss. It was a perfect system, almost mathematical, almost divine. But it was also a mirror with two sides, what was shown and what was hidden. The double entry was also a double truth, visible to the state, partners, and customers. the invisible one, reserved only for bankers and princes. Venice was the first to understand the power of numbers. Their merchants kept accounts that recorded not only merchandise, but also risks, insurance, and hidden interests. Every ship that set sail for the east carried gold and spices, but also sheets of secret accounts. If the ship returned, the benefit would appear in the visible logs. If the business went belly up, the losses could be hidden or quietly shared among the partners. Art wasn't just about marketing. It was about telling the truth in a convenient way. Double accounting became a form of financial diplomacy. Numbers were weapons of negotiation, instruments of trust, and at the same time, of deception. The merchant who mastered the pen had more power than the captain who mastered the helm. And so Venice ruled the Mediterranean with ink and parchment. Florence took this practice even further. Banking families like the Medici built empires with their secret books. In their records, kings appeared as debtors and popes as privileged clients. The Vatican itself relied on his accounts, although it never admitted it publicly. The official books showed a serene, balanced, and impeccable prosperity. But hidden in the parallel records were loans to bankrupt princes, bribes to cardinals, and war financing. Each transaction had two versions, one that could be displayed and one that needed to be hidden. The bankers were actors in a play where the audience saw only half of the script. The other half, the real one, was kept locked in dark rooms. That was the secret of Florentine power. The birth of modern accounting seemed like a triumph of transparency. A logical system that clearly organized the economy. But hidden within its very structure was the possibility of deception. Because if there were two columns, there was always the temptation to show one and hide the other. The merchant could balance his figures for the state while keeping another version for his partners. It could feign losses to pay less taxes, or feign profits to attract investors. The truth became a game of mirrors. What was in the books was as real as what was hidden. Accounting has ceased to be a simple record-keeping process and has become a narrative. A story shaped by the person holding the pen. The banker's power lay not only in their gold, but in their ability to rewrite reality. A loan could appear as a donation, a debt as an investment, a loss as an extraordinary expense. The art of accounting has become the art of interpretation. And each number became a word that could mean different things depending on who read it. The Venetian and Florentine bankers were actors in a silent theater. Before the people, they presented themselves as benefactors, patrons, and protectors of the arts. To the powerful, they presented themselves as indispensable allies. And they recognized themselves as the true masters of Europe's economic destiny. Because they knew that whoever controls the books controls history. And they held the invisible books in their hands. In the narrow streets of Venice and Florence, where commerce mingled with the murmur of water and the echo of Renaissance domes, a quiet revolution was born: double-entry bookkeeping. It wasn't a minor invention, but the creation of a mirror that reflected two truths at the same time. On the one hand, the visible record: profits, losses, debts, and payments neatly noted. On the other hand, the shadow: hidden transactions, covert favors, loans that didn't appear on any official scroll. It was an art of balance and masks, a language that allowed the king to show one version of himself and his associates a very different one. Venetian and Florentine bankers perfected this game with an elegance that bordered on the theatrical. The church could condemn usury, but parallel accounts allowed interest to be disguised as donations. Princes could exact tribute, but banking families hid fortunes in secret records. Double entry not only organized money, it multiplied it in appearance, expanding it like a mirage, creating confidence where there was no real backing. Accounting has ceased to be just a tool. and has become a weapon. Florence, under the Medici, built cathedrals and financed entire papacies with this dual system. Each column written in his books was a line between salvation and ruin. Merchants could sail to the east, go into debt beyond their means, and still maintain the appearance of prosperity thanks to the miracle of affluent numbers. Venice, with its trade routes, hid in the ink of its scribes the trail of wars, bribes, and pacts with enemy kingdoms. Money was no longer just power. It was also theater, illusion, accounting sleight of hand. Chapter 4. The War in the Hidden Numbers. Wars were never fought only with swords, bows, or cannons. Behind every crusade, every European conflict, there was another battle that couldn't be seen, the battle of numbers. Kings preached glory, popes spoke of faith, but bankers were the ones who really kept the fighting going. The armies did not march by divine inspiration, but by hidden loans, by treasures hidden in accounts that never reached the people. War, silently, was a business. The Crusades are remembered as campaigns of religious fervor, but in reality, they were also financial operations of unprecedented magnitude. The Templars, a military and religious order, became the first international bankers, guarding deposits and moving capital between kingdoms. A knight could deliver his possessions to Paris and retrieve them in Jerusalem, thanks to the secret network of deeds maintained by the order. The same journey that seemed spiritual was transformed into a covert transference. The Templars financed armor, ships, and supplies, while keeping records of figures that were not shown to any king. In Europe, the kingdoms learned quickly. To raise armies, monarchs could not rely solely on official taxes, which always aroused the ire of the people. That's why they resorted to secret loans, to pacts with Italian or Flemish bankers who advanced them money in exchange for future concessions. An indebted kingdom could mortgage its ports, mines, or trade routes without its people knowing. The price of war was paid in silence, with contracts locked in wooden chests and figures written on scrolls never to be revealed. The mercenaries, indispensable elements of these campaigns, did not fight for flags or anthems, but for wages secured in those invisible accounts. Every battle was, at its core, a transaction. A prince hired foreign troops, promised gold he didn't have, and signed agreements with bankers who accepted the debt as an investment. When victory came, the coffers were filled with loot. When defeat loomed, the people ended up burdened with hidden taxes. The blood on the battlefield was the ink of an unread contract. Byzantium and Imperial China also understood this secret. Royal treasuries were not just chests of gold, but parallel records that could inflate or deflate a kingdom's wealth as needed. An emperor could display abundance while actually mortgaging the future of his people. The archives, hidden in palaces and temples, contained the true expansion strategies, pacts with merchants, and debts owed to banking families. The power of an empire was measured both by its armies and by the number of accounting secrets it could sustain without collapsing. The relationship between war and underground banking was inseparable. Every conflict was an opportunity for enrichment for those who knew how to manipulate the numbers behind the scenes. Bankers didn't take sides. They financed a king today and his enemy tomorrow. Because the loyalty of the numbers was not to faith or country, but to profit. War then was always an equation. And so the invisible beads held up castles, ruined villages, and raised entire empires. No matter how much blood was shed, it was the sum of money in a hidden book that decided the fate. More battles were decided in the shadows of those records than on the battlefields. Because in the end, the war wasn't won by the strongest army, but by the most astute accountant. The Crusades were presented as sacred journeys to Jerusalem, but in reality they were also economic operations of colossal proportions. Moving armies across continents required not only faith, but ships, weapons, food, animals, and craftsmen. All of this had to be paid for with gold that kings rarely had available. It was then that the figure of the Templars appeared, that enigmatic order that not only fought in the name of the cross, but also invented a banking network capable of sustaining war for centuries. The Templars received deposits in Europe and converted them into credits across the sea, without having to transport chests full of gold. This system transformed the order into an international bank. A knight could donate land in Normandy and receive funding to arm himself in the Holy Land. The Templar records were secret, guarded like sacred relics. The faith of the people served as a facade, but what truly sustained the Crusades was an unprecedented financial mechanism. Battles were fought with swords, but they were won in the invisible accounts of the Templars. In Europe, monarchs quickly realized that military glory depended not on speeches, but on credit. Open taxes sparked rebellions, but secret loans offered a silent solution. The Medici in Florence, the Fuggers in Germany, and Flemish bankers advanced money to kings in exchange for exclusive concessions. A port, a mine, or even a tax collection could be pledged as collateral. Thus, kingdoms were sustained by promises signed in ink, not by gold in coffers. Mercenaries, in turn, were the fuel for these wars. They weren't fighting for flags or creeds, but for guaranteed pay. Each signed contract was equivalent to an army willing to shed blood on behalf of the highest bidder. But if the banker refused to release the money, the army wouldn't march. Kings then learned that wars weren't decided only on the battlefield, but also at the negotiating table with their lenders. Byzantium also kept its own secrets. The empire kept hidden treasure chests, parallel records, and agreements with Genoese and Venetian merchants that didn't appear in official records. An emperor could display splendor in processions and, at the same time, mortgage entire trade routes to support his military campaigns. Imperial China practiced similar techniques, invisible taxes and treasures hidden in forbidden palaces, known only to the scribes closest to the throne. The people believed in the emperor's infinite wealth, but what really sustained him were disguised loans and covert collections. Warfare, everywhere, depended on hidden numbers. Every sword shone with a debt. Every fortress was built with borrowed money. Every victory had a financial pact behind it that no one was supposed to know about. The blood spilled on the field was only the visible face of a secret calculation. And when the balance was broken, when debts became unpayable, kingdoms fell, not by the enemy's sword, but by the weight of their hidden accounts. In the end, the relationship between war and underground banking became inseparable. The bankers weren't soldiers, but they decided which armies marched and which stayed put. Chapter 5: Tainted Gold: The Secrets of Nazism. When World War II broke out, the Nazi armies advanced not only with tanks and rifles, but also with accountants who knew exactly what to loot. Each conquered city was a map of riches, central banks, gold reserves, jewels, and works of art. The strategy was simple: empty the treasures of the occupied nations and transfer them to the Reich's war machine. Polish, Czech, Belgian, and French gold were all melted down, stamped with German seals, and sent to vaults that knew no flag. Behind the roar of the cannons, there was a more sinister silence, that of safes closing on stolen fortunes. But the looting didn't end at the central banks. The property of Jewish families, their jewels, their sacred relics, were seized and turned into anonymous ingots. Human suffering was translated into balance sheets, and persecution into accounting calculations. Every deportation meant confiscation. Every train of prisoners also meant a train of confiscated wealth. The Nazi regime understood that the war could not be sustained without systematic plunder. Much of that gold went to Switzerland. a seemingly neutral country, but one whose banking system served as a refuge for blood-stained wealth. There, the ingots were melted down again, erasing stamps and markings, losing all trace of their origin. The looted gold was converted into legitimate gold, circulating unsuspectingly in international trade. Swiss banks offered absolute discretion, and that discretion was the mask that allowed the Reich to prolong its economic power. The paradox was brutal. While Europe burned, while millions were condemned to the silence of concentration camps, the vaults in Zurich and Bern were filled with stolen wealth. The bankers talked about neutrality, but what they practiced was complicity. The balance sheets were neat, the contracts were in order, but behind every figure lay a crime. Money, once again, proved to be stronger than justice, more silent than the cries of the victims. Today, decades later, there are still accounts that have not been opened, ingots that have not been traced, inheritances that have not been returned. The archives reveal untouchable balance sheets, sealed vaults, and documents. Chapter 6: IMF and World Bank, Invisible Loans. The end of World War II left Europe in ruins. Cities were in ashes, ports were destroyed, factories were reduced to rubble. The victors understood that reconstruction could not depend solely on speeches and treaties, but on something much more silent: money. It was then, in 1944, in the small town of Bretton Woods, that a new economic order was born. From that meeting of bankers, economists, and politicians emerged two institutions that would forever change the destiny of the world: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Originally, they were presented as guardians of stability and prosperity. The IMF, charged with monitoring monetary balances, preventing crises, and maintaining confidence in the international financial system. The World Bank, designed to finance the reconstruction of war-torn countries, to give them a future amidst despair. The speech was noble, the intentions seemed just. But behind that facade, a power was brewing that didn't make the headlines: the power of debt. Because every loan they offered came with conditions, clauses, and commitments. It wasn't money given freely, but tied to programs, reforms, and political decisions that countries had to accept without resistance. Money came to nations as a promise of salvation, but it often became an invisible chain. Governments could rebuild bridges, hospitals, and roads, but in return, they were caught in a web of financial obligations that stretched for decades. Help was never free. In Latin America, Africa, and Asia, this model has become a perpetual cycle. A country would receive a loan, invest part of it in development, but would soon have to resort to a new loan to pay the interest on the previous one. The numbers piled up in invisible balance sheets, figures the people never saw, but which determined their daily lives. Schools were closing, hospitals were collapsing, the price of bread was rising, and it was all written in pages of IMF reports that very few could read. The sacrifices of millions were summed up in a paragraph of austerity. The World Bank, for its part, promised development projects. But many of those projects became symbols of inequality: dams that displaced entire villages, roads that benefited a few, loans to corrupt elites who were never held accountable. Money was lost in shady channels, while countries were left with nothing but debt. The promised wealth never arrived, but payments were exacted with relentless punctuality. Thus, the balance sheets of these institutions grew, but the people were drowned in the silence of figures they would never understand. The most disturbing thing is that much of this power is not discussed in parliament or reported on newspaper front pages. Decisions are made in closed offices, in discreet meetings, in technical documents full of formulas and percentages. A small group of experts determines the fate of entire nations with a calculation, a prediction, a sealed report. People don't vote on these decisions, but they experience the consequences in the price of food, job losses, and the uncertainty of their future. The real power of the IMF and the World Bank lies not in the money they lend, but in the conditions they impose. And the most disturbing thing is that much of their operations remain invisible. The real numbers, the hidden projections, the confidential agreements don't make the headlines. Newspapers talk about international aid, but rarely explain the magnitude of the debts being silently signed. Modern chains are not made of iron or steel, but of financial clauses written in bureaucratic English. The slavery of our time is measured in interest, in terms, in conditions that seem neutral, but that determine the destiny of generations. The IMF and the World Bank were born as institutions of Chapter 7. Tax Havens. The Modern Temples of Hidden Money. On a world map, some points seem insignificant. Tiny islands lost in the Caribbean. Remote territories that barely occupy a few lines in geography textbooks. However, in the shadow economy, these small places have become modern temples of hidden money. Panama, the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Luxembourg, Monaco, Andorra. Names that sound exotic or distant, but are actually central pieces of the global financial landscape. They store, protect, and multiply a wealth that never appears in official reports. They are the safe havens where numbers are hidden, far from the sight of ordinary citizens, protected by the veil of laws designed to maintain secrecy. Tax havens weren't born as whims, but as strategic refugees. Originally, they offered a degree of flexibility to sailors, merchants, and bankers seeking to escape excessive taxes or empires claiming everything they touched. Over time, this flexibility transformed into a sophisticated legal and financial framework. Today, these jurisdictions offer opacity, discretion, and a legal shield capable of turning illicit millions into respectable fortunes. There, money finds refuge, a new identity, and above all, invisibility. Giant multinationals have perfected the art of moving their wealth through these locations. They fabricate a network of paper subsidiaries, shell companies, and hidden accounts that allow them to record their profits where they pay almost no taxes. Money flows from New York to Panama, from London to the Virgin Islands, from Tokyo to Luxembourg, without states being able to fully follow its trail. What appear to be legal transactions actually represent billions of dollars leaking from hospitals, schools, and public services. Tax evasion isn't visible on the streets, but it's felt in the lack of opportunities that affects millions. But it's not just corporations that take advantage of these safe havens. Politicians, celebrities, drug traffickers, dictators, and businessmen build impenetrable financial fortresses there. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and other leaks revealed only a fraction of that reality. There were well-known names, public figures who spoke of justice, transparency, and patriotism in their home countries, but secretly transferred their fortunes to unreachable accounts. The scandal lasted for weeks, but soon faded. The system remained intact, as if nothing had happened. Because the power of tax havens is silent. It doesn't require armies or cannons. All it takes are expert lawyers, creative accountants, and the willingness of governments that look the other way. The laws of those territories are designed to attract capital, not to judge it. And the more money comes in, the stronger the web of interest that ensures its survival becomes. A small state may have more registered companies than inhabitants, yet everything is considered perfectly legal. The most disturbing thing is that much of this money isn't illegal per se, but invisible. It's money that isn't taxed, that isn't declared, that doesn't return to the countries where it was generated. It's wealth without a flag, floating in a legal limbo that escapes the scrutiny of states. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens bear the fiscal burden, with direct and indirect taxes, supporting increasingly fragile public systems. The sacrifice of many maintains an order in which a few accumulate hidden fortunes. Tax havens are modern temples, not of faith, but of money. They worship capital without restrictions, without morals, without limits. Every law, every loophole, is an altar where money is purified from its origin and transformed into legitimate power. They are places where the official economy meets the underground, where the legal and the illicit coexist in silence. And the most disturbing thing is that the entire world depends on this system, even those who publicly criticize it. The invisible power of tax havens lies not only in the wealth they conceal. Chapter 8. The Hidden Present. Blockchain and New Shadows money has shed its skin many times throughout history. It went from stone and metal to paper, and then to electronic figures that are never touched. But in the 21st century, something different appeared, something that promised transparency and absolute freedom. Blockchain. A blockchain, a decentralized ledger that no one could erase, that no one could manipulate. At least, that was the promise. Cryptocurrencies, led by Bitcoin, have emerged as a challenge to central banks and governments. Money that didn't belong to any nation, that could circulate from person to person without intermediaries. An open ledger, visible in every transaction, but protected by the anonymity of digital keys. It was as if the old dream of pure, incorruptible accounting had finally been born. And millions embraced it as the hope for a new financial order. But in that same light, Shadow was also born. What seemed like a system designed for freedom soon became the perfect hiding place. Cryptocurrencies offered anonymity, and with it, the door opened for money laundering, drug trafficking transactions, and global tax evasion. What was supposed to be the most transparent record in history became fertile ground for invisible accounts. Blockchain, which was meant to be a shining mirror, began to reflect what no one wanted to see. The states reacted cautiously. Some tried to ban, others to regulate, and many decided to simply observe. Meanwhile, fortunes grew in digital wallets, inaccessible to the tax authorities, and impossible to confiscate without the private keys. Power was no longer in coffers or banks. It was in a password that could fit a man's memory. And that meant money had become more ethereal, more invisible than ever. Cryptocurrencies also opened the door to new elites. The first investors became millionaires overnight, creating a new lineage of digital moguls. These new lords of capital didn't need castles or armies. All that was needed was for their private key to remain intact. They were bankers to themselves, guardians of their own treasure in a world where no one could intervene. The much celebrated decentralization also ended up generating a new concentration of power. And even more disturbing is what comes next. Central banks, fearful of losing control, began designing their own digital currencies. China led the way with the digital yuan, and other countries followed suit. A currency controlled directly by the state, with the ability to track every payment, every expense, every transaction. What seemed like transparency soon revealed itself as total surveillance. The great paradox of blockchain is that its promise of absolute freedom can end in absolute control. What began as an open registry may become the most invasive registry in history. The financial future is torn between two extremes: a system where no one controls anything, or a system where everyone controls everything. And in both cases, the darkness spreads. Because transparency, paradoxically, can always become a new shadow. The hidden present is no longer in Swiss vaults or in papers hidden in secret offices. It's on invisible networks, on blockchains distributed across the planet. It's in digital wallets that fit on a chip, in unbreakable passwords, in transactions that cross borders in seconds. Final reflection. The book never closed. The history of money is not linear. It's a repeating cycle, a back and forth between light and shadow. Temples, kings, bankers, empires, modern states, and digital networks all have written their pages in the same book. A book that never ends. Every civilization believed it had achieved ultimate transparency. Mesopotamia relied on its tablets, Rome on its treasures, Florence on its double entry, Switzerland on its vaults, and now we on the blockchain. But behind the visible, there was always another accounting, another truth. A secret network of records that no one would admit to, but that everyone needed. And meanwhile, the average citizen saw only fragments. A receipt, a tax, a salary deposited into your account. The rest, the real figures, the invisible balance sheets, the backroom deals, remained hidden. What was visible was just a shadow cast by something much larger. That something is still alive today. In the invisible loans from global institutions, in the fortunes hidden in tax havens, in the cryptocurrencies floating around without a country or owner. The world moves to the rhythm of numbers we'll never see. And yet, those numbers determine our daily lives. You, the listener, are not a distant spectator. You are part of this system. Your salary, your taxes, the price of bread or transportation, everything is connected to that hidden ledger. You don't read it, you don't sign it, you don't fully understand it. But you sustain it every day with your work, with your faith in the currency you use, with your silent obedience. The hidden ledger isn't just an external mystery. It's the shadow that passes through your life without you seeing it. A secret script that is constantly rewritten with every crisis, with every loan, with every war. And like every forbidden book, it's full of invisible hands turning its pages. That's why the book never closes. Each generation thinks it understands, but all it does is add a new chapter of light and shadow. The names change, the symbols change, but the essence remains. Record what is seen, conceal what it sustains. Perhaps the biggest secret isn't in the numbers,